Okay, so good morning everybody. Assalamu alaikum. So first years, I thought that I would send you a recording of my a detailed description of the Bohr effect and the curve and some aspects to it, right? So right now I am zooming into the Bohr Shift curve or the oxygen dissociation curve. On the screen you can see that there is a curve that has been shifted to the right, which is this one, okay, and then there is another curve which is to the left side. Now if we look at this curve very carefully, we can see that the curve which is shifted to the right is the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin at the CO2 concentration around respiring cells. So when the cells are respiring, they are oxygen poor and carbon dioxide rich, which is why you can see that the concentration of carbon dioxide over here is 9.3 kilopascals. In other words, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 9.3 kilopascals, right? Whereas on the other hand, if we look at this curve, we can see that this is the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin as the carbon dioxide concentration in the of the blood in transit around the body happens, and which is about 5.3 kilopascals of carbon dioxide. So this means that this curve is representing the change that is happening with respect to a rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide over here is 9.3 kilopascals and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide over here is 5.3 kilopascals, right? We can see that. Now let's look at the partial pressure of oxygen in respiring cells. Now over here we are in respiring cells and over here we are in the lungs. So this means as we are moving from the respiring cells, when I say we are moving, actually what I mean is blood is moving. So as the blood is moving from the respiring cells to the lungs, you can see how the concentration of oxygen gas increases. For example, we've discussed this in the class that we define partial pressure of oxygen as the measure of the concentration of the oxygen gas. So you can see that the partial pressure of oxygen in respiring cells is somewhat between, I would say it's lying somewhere between 2.7 and 3. So close to that, right? Which is fairly understandable as far as the status of the respiring cells is concerned because they are oxygen poor. And then as we move from oxygen poor respiring tissues to oxygen rich poorly respiring tissues, we can see that the oxygen concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs is 14 kilopascals, right? Acha. Now let's look at this graph more deeply. Here we can see that if you look at this curve in which the Bohr, in which the oxygen dissociation curve is shifted to the right, or the Bohr effect is happening, the Bohr effect always happens in order to facilitate the release of oxygen. So this means that when the Bohr effect is happening, more oxygen is being released from hemoglobin as compared to being attached to hemoglobin. In other words, at higher CO2 concentrations, the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin will be less, right? So let's look at this for this curve. For this curve, we can see that the partial pressure of oxygen is this much, right? And the degree to which the hemoglobin is saturated is this much, right? Somewhere lying between 20 to 30%. Whereas if we look at the left curve, which is this curve in which the CO2 concentration is low, we can see that at the same partial pressure of oxygen, okay, the partial pressure of oxygen is not changing. For the same partial pressure of oxygen, when the CO2 is low, the hemoglobin is more saturated with oxygen. So you see the difference. The partial pressure of oxygen is the same, but the carbon dioxide concentrations are different. Over here, the carbon dioxide is high, and over here, the carbon dioxide is low. So you can see the difference, right? It very well explains you that CO2 plays a far more important role in detaching the oxygen from the hemoglobin as compared to the partial pressure of oxygen, right? So this is a somewhat extended explanation of the Bohr effect, right? Now moving to the transport of carbon dioxide in the blood, right? And there were some queries which different students had, so I am attending to those queries. So let me just read from this paragraph, and let me tell you that this is not your textbook, it's not Mary Joan, it's some other A-level textbook. I think it's the Oxford textbook, but I found this topic interesting over here, so I'm sharing it with you. The carbon dioxide gas is transported in the blood in both the plasma and the red blood cells. We just discussed it in the class today. 85% in the form of bicarbonate ions in the blood plasma, 5% in the form of dissolved carbon dioxide in the blood plasma, and 10% inside the red blood cells as carb amino hemoglobin, right? So it says that CO2 is transported in the blood in both the plasma and the red blood cells mainly as hydrogen carbonate ions, 85%, right? Both the plasma and the red blood cells. So this means that, this actually technically means that we have bicarbonate ions inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cells, and we have them floating and circulating in the blood plasma. How did we get them? Inside your red blood cells, we all know there is an enzyme carbonic anhydrase, right, that catalyzes the conversion of CO2 and water to bicarbonate ions and H plus ions, right? The enzyme carbonic anhydrase which catalyzes this reaction is present in the red blood cells, and the hydrogen ions, we all know they will become quickly associated with hemoglobin to form hemoglobinic acid, which is HHB. In effect, the hemoglobin molecules will act as a buffer for hydrogen ions, preventing the blood from becoming too acidic. Right now, this is not our concern. Our concern is to understand the transport of carbon dioxide in the body and also to understand the chloride shift. Let's first dig deep into the chloride shift. Look at the wordings of this book. It says, the charged ions such as H plus and bicarbonate are usually unable to pass through the plasma membrane of the red blood cells, but the red blood cells can exchange these bicarbonate ions for chloride ions using an anion exchanger protein embedded in their membranes. So in the class today, we were talking about the fact that your red cell membranes are impermeable to H plus ions. I did not mention about the red blood cells being impermeable to bicarb ions. But this information is written over here, but it says that these ions cannot go alone outside or inside. They have to be coupled with an exchanger protein, an anion exchanger protein, which is embedded. It's a transport protein which is embedded in the cell membrane of the red blood cell, and through this what will happen? The bicarbonate can move out in exchange for chloride ions moving in, right? Not only this will help the bicarbonate ions to move out, but it will also allow the chloride ions to come in and sort of balance the acidity inside your red blood cell, right? I think it's this kind of transport is very similar to the sucrose and the H plus ions co-transport in the phloem. Okay, let's move on. Still the discussion is not finished. Let's look at this diagram and the description. Okay, I'm just reading from the text and pay attention to this. As the hydrogen carbonate ions diffuse out of the red blood cells, technically they couldn't, but they are diffusing out of the red blood cells through the anion exchanger protein channel that is exchanging bicarbonate ions for chloride. So bicarbonate ions moving out and chloride ions moving in. As the bicarbonate ions diffuse out of the red blood cells, there is an increasing positive charge inside the red blood cell, right? Negativity is leaving the red blood cell, so this results in a relative positivity inside the red blood cell. Another reason for the relative positivity is we all know that there are H plus ions also inside the red blood cells. Today, I think Ali was, asking this question, Miss, how come the H plus ions are building up inside the red blood cell when they will quickly combine with hemoglobin? Yes, they should technically quickly combine with hemoglobin to produce hemoglobinic acid, but there is a chance that there might be an accumulation of H plus ions. So just to, minimize the possibility of a buildup of intracellular positivity, we have these negatively charged chloride ions which will move into the red blood cell to balance out all these differences in the charges or the potential difference across the surface of the red cell membrane, returning the pH to a neutral value, right? This is known as the chloride shift, and the chloride shift prevents the blood from becoming too acidic. So I had actually already told you that I will give you some more detailed information about the chloride shift, so there it is. If you haven't understood this, you can again, listen to my recording once again and things will become clear. Let's move on to the next bit. It says 5% of the carbon dioxide remains as carbon dioxide in the blood, in the plasma, right? Dissolved carbon dioxide in the blood plasma. A further 10% combines with hemoglobin, reacting with the amine groups to form carbaminohemoglobin. In the lungs, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide there allows these forms of carbon dioxide to be released also. Now comes a beautiful diagram over here in this book that explains changes that are happening in the alveolus and in the tissue fluid, right? And I will try to zoom into this diagram as much as possible so that you guys can see and understand what is happening. Let's first deal with this bit, okay? This part of the diagram. And then I will deal with this part of the diagram. So let's start. Look now. Over here, you can see this is tissue fluid, right? And this is the red blood cells. So this means that, okay, let me just draw the boundaries. If this is a red blood cell, then this means that this is your capillary, because a red blood cell will always remain inside the capillary. It will never leave. We know that the fenestrations in the capillary endothelium are not as big to allow the red blood cells to move out. Okay? So let's assume this is the capillary, right? And anything which is outside the capillary is the tissue fluid. This is the tissue fluid. So if this is the tissue fluid, then this means that there might be cells here and there. So let me just draw two cells, the tissue cells, and this is the tissue fluid, right? Acha. When I say tissue fluid, tissue cells, it means they are respiring tissues. Okay? What's written over here? Respiring tissue. So we are in the respiring tissue, and since cellular respiration is taking place in the respiring tissue, so we expect the concentration of oxygen to be less in the respiring tissues because they are oxygen poor, and the concentration of carbon dioxide to be more in the respiring tissues. Where is that? Let's look at this. Oxygen in low concentration, CO2 in high concentration. Okay? Acha. Now let's see what's happening. Since CO2 is high, so the CO2 is, and the dotted line is showing you the diffusion, right? So since CO2 is high in the tissue fluid, CO2 will move from the tissue fluid, cross the endothelial cells of the capillary, and it will enter inside the capillary. Where will the CO2 go? It will diffuse into the red blood cell. You can see this is the red blood cell, right? The red blood cell has got all the provisions to tackle or to deal with the CO2. So let's see what's happening. CO2 plus water gives rise to this plus this, right? H plus ions, what are they doing? They are causing the hemoglobin to get rid of its oxygen to release the oxygen, and the result is the formation of hemoglobinic acid. Theek? This is done. And then what do we see? As soon as the oxygen is released, do we want this oxygen to be released or to diffuse into the respiring cells which are oxygen poor? Yes, we do. So see what's happening to this oxygen. It can quickly diffuse out of the red cell membrane. This is the red cell membrane. This is the membrane of the capillary, the endothelial membrane. ठीक है, दो membranes हैं यहाँ पे. So the oxygen will diffuse out, then again it will diffuse out, and where is it going? Again it's going to enter into the red blood cells. You know, sometimes in the exams they ask you how many cell membranes does oxygen have to actually cross. Many cell membranes. Number one, the cell membrane of the red blood cell. Number two, the endothelial, the gaps in the endothelial layer of the capillary. Number three, the cell membrane of the cell itself, the respiring cell, right? So that is done. Now, what do we do, or what changes happen, or how does the exchange of gases happen in the alveoli, right? Because this is the tissue fluid. So we all know we should always have a holistic picture of how processes are happening inside the body. So see how beautifully this has been explained over here, that the blood is not static in your body. It is constantly in a circular motion, right? It is being pumped through the action of the heart, and it's in there's a double circulation, and the blood is moving by the pumping action of the heart. So of course we expect that same blood to reach your lungs. Okay, let's see what's happening inside the lungs. Now in the lungs, again, where are we? What is this part? This is your, let me draw it in red. This is your capillary, the alveolar capillary, and we have the same kind of capillary in the lungs as well, right? Acha. And this is the air in the alveolus. So this means that we've done gas exchange. So if I want to draw like this, let's suppose that this is your air in the alveolus, and every alveolus is supplied by a blood capillary. Okay? Let me draw the alveolus in blue so as to make a difference. So this is your alveolus, okay, and every alveolus is supplied by, or is surrounded by, these blood capillaries, and one of this blood capillary has been enlarged to show you what's happening. Let's have a look. Okay, now we know that when we are inside the alveolus, what's there in the alveolus? Wait a minute, let me just use the proper colors. So the air in the alveolus has a higher oxygen concentration and a low carbon dioxide concentration, and we want the air in the alveolus to allow this oxygen to move from the alveolus into the alveolar capillary. So look what's happening. Oxygen high, right? So it's moving from the air in the alveolus into the capillary. पहले ये capillary wall को cross करेगा, then it will cross the membrane of the red blood cell. Where is the oxygen going? Oxygen is going to displace this. The hemoglobinic acid that was found in the red blood cell will now be broken down. Why? Because this oxygen needs to bind to hemoglobin. So this is the place where I would say that the partial pressure of the oxygen will be around, as per that graph, it should be around 14 kilopascals, right? When it is around 14 kilopascals, we will see that the hemoglobin is attached to oxygen. The hemoglobin has a very high affinity for oxygen. At this place, I would say that my oxygen saturation for hemoglobin is around 98 to 99%, and I am inside the lungs. Okay, acha, done. What are we going to do? When we will break this down, we will be having excess of H plus ions. So all those H plus ions, what will they do? They will combine with okay, so these H plus ions are produced, and then at the same time, since we know that these H plus ions can technically combine with bicarbonate ions, okay, and where did these bicarbonate ions come from? Hydrogen carbonate ions diffuse into the red blood cells and are converted to carbon dioxide gas. We all know that the blood plasma was having lots of bicarbonate ions, जो कि यहाँ से नीचे से आ रहा था, right? So all those hydrogen carbonate ions, they can diffuse into the red blood cell, right? They will combine with the H plus ions that have been right now released, okay, and then again they will form water and carbon dioxide, and all this carbon dioxide, where will it go? This carbon dioxide, see what is it doing? It's diffusing out of the red blood cell, then it's diffusing out of the capillary, and then it's going into the alveolus, and we are going to exhale this air into the, carbon dioxide diffuses into the air in the alveolus, and we will be exhaling this air outside our body. This question may come in your mind that, Miss, just now you said that the bicarbonate ions cannot diffuse inside. They can if the exchanger anion channel protein, which helps in the two-way movement of bicarbonate ions and chloride ions, if it's present, and it's of course present in the red blood cell membrane, again over here this will do the same role, right? So I hope you guys have understood this whole process, and if still there is any problem, you can always ask a question. I'll be sharing these slides with you as well, so that your concepts are even better.